Maya Kingston was sitting in class, her pen tapping absent-mindedly against the edge of her notebook, when the door swung open. The room fell silent as two uniformed officers stepped inside. Her teacher hesitated mid-sentence, her eyes darting between the officers and Maya, while the students whispered among themselves. The taller officer, a man with sharp eyes and a rigid posture, scanned the classroom before nodding at his partner. Maya Kingston? The sound of her name sent a chill down her spine, but she kept her face neutral, just as her grandfather had always taught her. Never show fear. She swallowed hard, stood up slowly and met their gaze. Come with us. The command was firm, leaving no room for argument. She could feel the weight of every stare in the room, the judgment, the curiosity, the quiet amusement from some who enjoyed watching someone else's downfall. As soon as they stepped into the hallway, the shorter officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest," he said, his tone detached, like this was just another routine task. "For what?" Maya's voice was steady, but her pulse pounded in her ears. "Felony theft and destruction of property," the taller one answered, snapping the cuffs around her wrists with a cold efficiency. The metal bit into her skin, sharp and unforgiving. "You have the right to remain silent." His voice droned on, reciting the Miranda rights, but Maya barely heard him. She focused on controlling her breathing, forcing herself to stand straight even as they led her through the hall, past students pressing against lockers, their eyes wide with shock. Some whispered her name, others smirked. They didn't know the truth. They didn't care. The police car smelled like stale coffee and old leather. The ride to the station was silent except for the occasional crackle of the radio. Maya stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur past. She wasn't sure if she should be angry, scared, or numb. By the time they pulled into the station, she settled on one thing: she wasn't going down without a fight. The booking process was cold, mechanical. They took her fingerprints, snapped her mugshot, and led her to a small, windowless room with flickering fluorescent lights. Minutes stretched into an hour before the door finally creaked open, and a man in a cheap gray suit stepped inside, flipping through a folder as he sat across from her. Thomas Grant, public defender. His tie was loose, his expression bored, like he'd already made up his mind about her. "All right, kid," he sighed, barely glancing at her. "This is serious. You're looking at felony charges. You could do time." Maya clenched her fists beneath the table. "I didn't do anything." Grant barely reacted. "The prosecution has footage of you inside Davidson and Company. Jewelry. A witness identified you fleeing the scene. The store's security system was disabled right after you reached into the display case." He closed the folder and met her eyes for the first time. "Best thing you can do is plead guilty. They'll go easy on you, maybe probation, maybe juvie. Take the deal." She didn't blink. "I'm not taking any deal for something I didn't do." Grant sighed, rubbing his temples. "Listen, I know how these cases go. The system isn't fair, but fighting this will only make it worse. There's no evidence in your favor." Maya leaned forward, her jaw tightening. "Then we find some." The courtroom was colder than it should have been. The air conditioning hummed softly, but it wasn't just the chill that made Maya's skin prickle. It was the way people looked at her, the judge's indifference, the jury's quiet judgment, the way prosecutor Jared Miller barely glanced at her before shuffling his papers. He was tall, polished, with the smug confidence of a man who rarely lost. When he spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The defendant was seen on surveillance footage at the scene of the crime. A store employee witnessed her running away. The stolen items have not been recovered, but the circumstances speak for themselves. This was no accident." He turned slightly, glancing at the jury. This was a calculated crime. Maya sat still, her hands resting on the table, fingers barely twitching. She forced herself to keep breathing evenly, to ignore the eyes burning into her. From the corner of her vision, she spotted her grandfather sitting quietly in the gallery. Elijah Kingston, with his graying beard and weathered hands, didn't move, didn't react. But Maya knew that look, the same one he always had when life threw another battle at them. He wasn't worried. He was waiting. Watching. He trusted her to stand her ground. And she would. Because she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting against a system that had already decided she was guilty. The courtroom was silent as the screen flickered to life, the grainy black and white security footage filling the space with a cold, distant reality. The camera angle was tilted slightly downward, capturing the inside of Davidson and Company. Jewelry in the moments before the crime. A figure in a dark hoodie approached the display case, moving with quick, deliberate motions, their face obscured by the raised hood. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the speakers, sharp and undeniable, as the figure reached inside, grabbing handfuls of jewelry before turning and disappearing out of the frame. Prosecutor Miller let the video play out in silence, then turned to the jury, his face carefully neutral, his voice smooth. Ladies and gentlemen, what you just saw is clear evidence. This is the defendant committing the crime. The timing aligns with when the alarm was triggered. The store employee saw her fleeing. And now, here she is before you. He paused, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Maya. Caught. Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. She could feel the weight of every stare, the quiet expectation that she would crumble under the evidence. Instead, she focused on the screen, on the details. The person in the footage was her height, her build, but something felt off. She narrowed her eyes, watching the moment the figure reached into the case. Their left hand, unmistakably visible, bore a thick silver ring on the index finger. A ring Maya had never owned. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay still, her mind racing. Then she noticed something else. The shoes. The person in the video wore sneakers with a distinctive logo on the side. Expensive, flashy, a brand she had never been able to afford. Judge Fallon shifted in his chair, his expression unreadable. Miss Kingston, he said, his voice cutting through the room. You seem particularly focused on the footage. Is there something you'd like to say? Maya inhaled slowly, then lifted her chin. Yes, Your Honor. The room tensed. The person in that video isn't me. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Miller let out a short, amused breath, shaking his head. That's a convenient claim, Miss Kingston. But the video, look at their left hand, Maya interrupted, her voice firm. They're wearing a ring. I don't wear rings. Fallon's gaze flicked back to the screen, his fingers lacing together as he considered her words. Miller, however, wasn't about to let the moment slip. That proves nothing. Rings can be removed. Maya didn't flinch. And the shoes? They're a limited edition pair. I couldn't afford those even if I wanted to. Fallon exhaled through his nose, his expression shifting slightly, his posture less rigid. Prosecutor Miller, do you have any additional footage? Perhaps something clearer? Miller hesitated for half a second, barely noticeable but enough for Maya to see the crack in his confidence. The footage we have is what was provided by the store's security system, he said, his voice measured. It's more than enough. Maya met his gaze, steady, unwavering. Enough for what? To accuse me? Or to prove I did it? Fallon watched the exchange closely, his fingers tapping against the bench. We'll revisit this, he said at last, shifting his attention. For now, let's move forward. But Maya saw it, the first sign of doubt in the judge's eyes. He wasn't convinced, not entirely. Later that evening, in the dimly lit visitor's room of the juvenile facility, Maya sat across from her grandfather, the metal table between them cold and unyielding. Elijah Kingston was calm as always, his sharp eyes studying her with the quiet intensity of a man who had seen too much, fought too many battles, and knew exactly what kind of fight this was. They don't care about the truth, he said finally, his voice low but steady. They care about a conviction. Maya exhaled sharply. I know. Elijah leaned forward slightly. Do you? Because this isn't just about you, Maya. It's about the way they see you. A black girl in the system is already guilty before she even speaks. She clenched her fists. Then I'll make them listen. A small, almost imperceptible nod. Approval. Good, he said simply. Then you'd better be ready. The next morning, Miller sat in his office, staring at the case file in front of him. The girl was smart, smarter than most. He had expected her to break, to panic, to fold under the weight of the evidence, but instead, she was finding cracks, forcing questions he hadn't prepared for. That couldn't happen. Not now, not when his case was supposed to be airtight. He needed to shut this down before it got out of hand. With a slow, calculated breath, he picked up his phone. "We need another witness," he said into the receiver. "Someone who saw her. Find me something." Maya sat in the corner of the juvenile detention library, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above her, the weight of a thick legal book pressing against her lap. The words blurred together at times, dense with technical jargon, but she forced herself to focus, to absorb, to understand. The system wanted to bury her, to shove her into a box labeled guilty, but she refused to go quietly. She traced each law, each precedent, memorizing what she needed to know. Burden of proof is on the prosecution. Reasonable doubt must be considered. No physical evidence means circumstantial arguments are weak. The words became weapons, and she was preparing for war. The next day in court, Miller stood with the same smug confidence, but this time, there was a twist. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to introduce a new witness," he announced, his tone casual, as if he weren't pulling another move straight out of a rigged playbook. The doors opened, and a man in his late 40s stepped inside, his suit slightly wrinkled, his expression nervous but determined. Andrew Holloway, Miller continued, was outside Davidson and Company on the night of the crime. He saw the defendant leaving the store. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maya's pulse quickened, but she kept her face blank. Another witness. Another lie. Holloway took the stand, clearing his throat before speaking. "I was walking past when I saw her," he said, nodding towards Maya. "She was running fast. Looked nervous." Miller smiled, feigning concern. "You're absolutely sure it was her?" Holloway hesitated for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but Maya caught it. "Yes," he said, but there was doubt in his voice. Maya leaned toward her lawyer, but Grant barely reacted. "Useless." She exhaled sharply. "I want to cross-examine him," she said aloud. The courtroom stilled. Judge Fallon raised an eyebrow. "Miss Kingston, that is highly irregular." Maya squared her shoulders. "So is putting a kid on trial with no real evidence. If I'm fighting for my future, I should be able to question the people trying to take it away from me." Fallon studied her, then nodded. "Proceed." She stood, feeling every eye in the room drilling into her. "Mr. Holloway," she began, her voice even, controlled. "You say you saw me running from the store." He nodded. "Did you see my face clearly?" He hesitated. "Well, not exactly, but, so you assumed it was me?" Maya pressed. "No, I recognized you," he said quickly. "I saw the hoodie." Maya turned to the jury. "The hoodie," she repeated. "The one in the security footage?" Holloway nodded. "Yes." Maya inhaled slowly, then gestured to the screen. "Play it again." The courtroom watched as the footage replayed, the hooded figure moving swiftly, grabbing jewelry, vanishing. Maya let the moment settle before speaking. "Look at their hair." Fallon leaned forward slightly. The figure in the footage, though obscured, had short-cropped hair at the base of their neck. Maya, however, pulled her own long, tightly coiled braids over her shoulder. "I haven't cut my hair in years," she said, her voice razor-sharp. "If I was the person in that footage, I would have had to chop it off and magically regrow it before my arrest." The jury shifted. Miller's jaw clenched. Fallon tapped his gavel once. "Prosecutor Miller, do you have an explanation?" Miller's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Eyewitnesses aren't perfect, Your Honor." Maya tilted her head. "And yet you expect them to convict me based on their perfect memory?" Silence. Fallon glanced at her, something shifting in his gaze. "That was well argued, Miss Kingston," he admitted. "We'll take this into consideration." That night, Elijah sat across from a contact of his, an old friend with connections. "Miller didn't just find a new witness," the man said, sliding a paper across the table. "He made one." Elijah's eyes darkened as he read the report. Holloway hadn't come forward voluntarily. Someone had pressured him into testifying. Someone who needed Maya to lose. Elijah exhaled slowly, folding the paper. Then it's time we push back. Maya sat straight in her chair, her hands clasped together, her eyes locked onto Prosecutor Miller as he paced the courtroom floor, delivering his carefully crafted argument. His voice was steady, polished, dripping with the confidence of a man used to winning. He turned to the jury, his suit crisp, his posture rigid. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant was seen at the scene, the security footage aligns with the timeline of the crime, and a witness has testified to seeing her flee. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about doubt. It's about justice. Maya waited a beat, then leaned forward slightly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. If I'm guilty, she said evenly, where are the stolen jewels? A ripple moved through the courtroom. Miller froze for the briefest second, then quickly recovered, straightening his tie, his expression carefully neutral. The defendant is attempting to distract from the facts, he said, his tone measured. The absence of stolen goods does not negate the crime. Maya tilted her head, her voice calm but sharp. Actually it does. Theft means something was stolen. If you don't have the necklace, the rings, the bracelets, how do you know I took them? Miller's jaw clenched. He glanced at the judge as if hoping Fallon would shut her down, but the judge only folded his hands, watching intently. Maya didn't stop. You've built this case on the assumption that I committed a crime, but you have no physical evidence. No stolen property. No fingerprints. Just a blurry video and a witness who barely saw anything. The jury was listening now, shifting in their seats. Miller knew it. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. We don't need to recover the stolen items to prove guilt, he argued. Criminals often discard evidence. Maya didn't blink. Then show me proof that I had them in the first place. Silence. Miller's fingers twitched slightly at his side. He knew he was losing ground, and Maya knew it too. That night, Elijah Kingston sat in his small living room, papers spread out across the table, his eyes scanning every detail of the case files he had managed to get his hands on. He had spent decades understanding how the system worked, how it manipulated truth, how it buried inconvenient details. He wasn't about to let it bury his granddaughter. A name caught his eye. A log entry. Surveillance system disabled for maintenance, one night before the robbery. His breath stilled. That hadn't been mentioned in court. That hadn't been mentioned anywhere. If the cameras had been turned off intentionally, that meant someone had planned for them to be down. Someone had orchestrated this. The next day in court, Maya faced Holloway again, her eyes steady as he sat uncomfortably on the witness stand. His hands fidgeted against his lap, his gaze flickering toward Miller as if searching for reassurance. Maya folded her arms. Mr. Holloway, when you saw the person running from the store, how far away were you? He swallowed. Maybe 10, 15 feet? Maya nodded. And it was dark, right? Yeah, but the streetlights, so you saw their face clearly? Holloway hesitated, barely a second, but it was enough. Well, not clearly, but I recognized the hoodie. Maya's voice sharpened. The hoodie you saw in a video later? Holloway shifted. I saw it that night too. Did you? Maya leaned forward. Or did you just assume after seeing the footage? His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Miller stiffened in his chair. The tension in the room was thick. Maya didn't let up. Did you actually see my face, Mr. Holloway? The silence stretched. Finally, his voice, smaller this time, no. Judge Fallon exhaled, tapping his fingers against the bench before speaking. Given the inconsistencies in testimony and the concerns raised, I am granting the defense additional time to investigate. Miller's expression darkened, but Maya felt it, a shift in the air. The case wasn't over, but for the first time, she had more than just a fight, she had a chance. Judge Fallon stood in his chambers, arms crossed, studying Maya with an unreadable expression. The door was closed, the air thick with something heavier than formality. Miss Kingston, he said finally, his voice measured but laced with curiosity. You know the law better than most lawyers who stand in my courtroom. Why? Maya met his gaze without hesitation, her spine straight, her hands steady at her sides. Because I have to, she said simply. Because kids like me don't get the benefit of the doubt. Because if I don't know my rights, someone will decide for me that I don't have any. Fallon exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping lightly against his desk. And who taught you to think like that? Maya didn't blink. The system did. A beat of silence passed, the weight of her words settling in the space between them. Fallon's jaw tightened, but there was something else in his expression now, something almost like respect. Across town, Elijah Kingston sat across from a journalist in a dimly lit diner, his hands clasped around a cup of black coffee, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion lining his face. The case isn't just weak, he said, his voice low, firm. It's a setup. The journalist, a middle-aged woman with keen eyes and a notepad covered in shorthand scribbles, tapped her pen against the table. What makes you so sure? Elijah slid a folder across the table. The evidence list. It's changed 3 times. First, the missing necklace was in the report. Then it wasn't. Then it came back again. Someone's manipulating this case. The journalist's gaze flicked over the documents, her expression shifting from curiosity to something harder. And you think they want her convicted no matter what? Elijah nodded. They don't need the truth. They need a conviction. The article hit the internet that evening, the headlines stark and unflinching. 15-year-old black girl faces felony charges despite lack of evidence. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Comments flooded in, some skeptical, but many outraged. How is this even a case? The justice system is broken. Free Maya Kingston. Strangers posted videos dissecting the trial, activists picked up the story, pressure began to build. Back in her cell, Maya sat on the edge of the cot, flipping through the case documents Grant had barely bothered to read. Something wasn't right. The evidence log had been updated too many times, details shifting just slightly. A missing necklace, then a recovered necklace, then a different description of it altogether. Someone was changing the narrative. Someone was trying to control what the court believed. But that night, Elijah's phone rang at 2 a.m. He answered groggily, rubbing a hand over his face. Kingston, a low voice warned, slow, deliberate. Drop this. Walk away. Or next time, it won't just be a phone call. The line went dead. Elijah sat in the dark, heart steady, mind racing. He wasn't scared. He was ready. Because now, more than ever, he knew Maya wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting against something much bigger. And whoever was behind it was starting to feel desperate. Maya sat across from Prosecutor Miller in a sterile, windowless conference room, her hands resting on the cold metal table. He leaned forward, his perfectly pressed suit unwrinkled despite the long hours he had undoubtedly spent preparing for this moment. Miss Kingston, he began, his voice smooth, practiced. I'm here to offer you a way out. She didn't blink, didn't react, just waited for him to continue. Plead guilty, he said, sliding a neatly typed document toward her. Admit to being at the store that night. Say it was a mistake, maybe a dare gone too far. In return, you'll get a reduced sentence. 6 months probation, maybe even less. No juvie, no permanent record. He smiled slightly as if offering her a favor. This is the best deal you're going to get. Maya let the silence stretch, let him believe, for just a second, that she was considering it. Then she leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and met his gaze with cold defiance. I'm not guilty, she said evenly. And I won't lie just to make your job easier. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered, a brief flash of irritation before he masked it with indifference. You understand what you're risking? He asked. If this goes to trial, I won't be offering this again. Maya tilted her head. But, because I wouldn't take it anyway. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Maya stood before the judge, her voice steady, unwavering. Your Honor, the prosecution offered me a plea deal, she announced, her words echoing against the polished wood and cold marble. They want me to confess to something I didn't do. I'm saying it now, on record, in front of everyone, I refuse. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Judge Fallon's expression remained neutral, but the way he glanced at Miller suggested he wasn't pleased. Miller, on the other hand, clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the files in front of him. Maya saw it, the frustration, the slow unraveling of his confidence. Meanwhile, Elijah Kingston was sitting in a small cafe across town, his eyes locked on the man across from him, a local activist who had spent years digging into legal corruption. "You're right," the man said, sliding a file across the table. "Miller isn't just handling this case, he's personally connected to the store owner. They've known each other for years. Campaign donations, shared business interests. This trial isn't about justice. It's about protecting someone." Elijah flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening with every page. "Then we expose it." At that same moment, the journalist who had taken on Maya's case was sitting in her office, surrounded by stacks of notes, court records, and leaked documents. She had spent the last week chasing whispers, following the money trail, and now she had something real. The security footage was tampered with, she muttered under her breath, scrolling through time-stamped records. There were 2 different versions submitted. Someone edited the original. She grabbed her phone, dialing Elijah's number. "I think I just found our smoking gun." The next day, court resumed, and Judge Fallon adjusted his glasses before speaking. "There have been concerning developments in this case," he said, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom before landing on Miller. "The defense has requested that the store owner be called to the stand. I'm granting that request." Miller stiffened, but before he could object, the judge continued. "Mr. Davidson, please step forward." The store owner, a man in his late 50s with a receding hairline and a carefully tailored suit, stood, his face suddenly a shade paler than before. He smoothed his tie as he approached the witness stand, but Maya saw it, the way his fingers trembled slightly, the way he avoided looking at Miller. He was nervous, and nervous men made mistakes. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as the defense attorney stepped forward, a USB drive clutched between his fingers. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "we have obtained new evidence, footage from a security camera across the street that was not included in the initial case files." A murmur spread through the audience, heads turning, whispers breaking the silence. Judge Fallon narrowed his eyes, his gaze shifting toward Prosecutor Miller, whose expression remained carefully blank, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. "Proceed," the judge said, gesturing toward the bailiff. The drive was plugged in, and within moments, the courtroom monitor flickered to life. The footage was clearer than the grainy black and white recording they had been shown before. The timestamp matched the night of the crime. A hooded figure approached the jewelry store, their movements quick, calculated. Then, as they turned toward the entrance, the camera caught their face, sharp jawline, light skin, short hair. Not Maya. The image was undeniable. Miller shot up from his seat. "Objection. This footage is unreliable. There is no proof that it hasn't been altered." His voice was sharp, laced with a hint of panic, his composure slipping for the first time since the trial began. Judge Fallon exhaled through his nose, unimpressed. "Are you suggesting the footage was fabricated?" Miller hesitated, caught between defending his case and admitting that evidence could be manipulated, something he had previously dismissed when it worked in his favor. "We cannot confirm the authenticity of this tape," he said finally, his tone strained. "The defense could have acquired it under questionable circumstances." Maya, sitting calmly beside her lawyer, leaned forward. "You didn't have any problems using security footage to accuse me," she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "Why is it a problem now?" The jury was watching, their expressions shifting. Doubt had seeped into their minds. Meanwhile, across town, Elijah Kingston sat in a cafe with the journalist, sliding another folder across the table. "Davidson isn't just a victim of theft," he said, tapping the papers. "He's been caught filing false insurance claims before. Small amounts, nothing too big, just enough to stay under the radar." The journalist skimmed the documents, her brow furrowing. "And this time?" she asked. Elijah met her gaze. $15,000 in stolen merchandise. And now, suddenly, a case with no physical evidence, Only a shaky witness and a convenient security failure? Someone's covering for him. The journalist nodded, her pen already moving across her notepad. Then let's make sure the public knows. Back in the courtroom, Maya tilted her head, her voice calm but sharp. Where are the stolen jewels? She asked again, looking directly at Miller. If I took them, where are they? The question hung in the air. Miller didn't answer. The jury was watching him now, waiting. Judge Fallon exhaled, turning to the prosecution. That's a fair question, he said, his tone firm. Mr. Miller, can you present any physical evidence connecting Miss Kingston to the stolen merchandise? Silence. Davidson, sitting stiffly at the witness stand, tugged at his collar, his eyes darting toward Miller, then back to the judge. I don't know, he stammered. Fallon's gaze sharpened. You don't know. Davidson swallowed, his fingers gripping the edge of the stand. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. Maya watched him closely. He was cracking. The pressure was mounting. His voice wavered. Maybe the inventory was off. Maybe the stolen pieces weren't actually taken. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Fallon's expression darkened. Are you saying the theft didn't happen? Davidson opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands trembled. Miller sat frozen, his face pale. The case was unraveling and everyone knew it. Judge Fallon exhaled sharply, the tension in the courtroom thick enough to choke on. His fingers tapped against the polished wood of his bench, his gaze flickering between the prosecutor, the defense, and the trembling store owner who had just thrown the entire case into chaos. We are taking a recess, he announced, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. This court will reconvene after a closed session. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and within moments, the murmurs of the gallery swelled into a wave of noise as people tried to process what had just happened. Maya sat still, her heartbeat steady, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. She had come too far for this to slip through her fingers now. Behind closed doors, the air was thick with unspoken tension as Fallon sat across from Miller, his expression unreadable. You're losing control of this case, counselor, the judge said, his tone cool, measured. Miller clenched his jaw, his frustration barely restrained. With all due respect, Your Honor, we cannot let a technicality derail justice. Fallon arched an eyebrow. A technicality? He echoed, his voice dangerously low. You presented a case built on circumstantial evidence, pressured a witness into testifying, and ignored glaring inconsistencies. That is not justice. That is a fabrication. Miller's hands balled into fists. You're letting a child manipulate this courtroom, he snapped. She's playing you. You and the jury. Fallon's gaze sharpened. Watch your tone, counselor. But Miller wasn't backing down. You and I both know how this ends, he said through gritted teeth. If you let her walk, you set a precedent. You send a message that people can challenge this system and win. And we both know that's not how it works. Fallon stared at him, his face a mask of restrained fury. Maybe that's exactly the problem, he said quietly. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the world was catching fire. The latest article had dropped, and with it, the public outrage had reached a boiling point. Prosecutor caught manipulating evidence in case against black teen. The words were bold, unapologetic, and damning. Within hours, the story had spread across social media, with activists, lawyers, and everyday people calling for an investigation into the trial. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Maya," and "We see the truth," while reporters swarmed the steps, demanding statements from anyone who would speak. The pressure was mounting, and even the system couldn't ignore it. Back inside, Fallon sat alone in his chambers, rubbing his temples. He had seen corruption before, had watched the way the system chewed up those who didn't have the power or resources to fight back. But this time, he had been forced to look it in the eye, to acknowledge what had been in front of him all along. The girl had been right from the start. The case was never about justice. It was about control. And he was tired of pretending otherwise. When the court reconvened, the room was packed, the energy electric with anticipation. Fallon's expression was impassive as he looked over the room, then down at Maya. Will the defendant please rise? Maya stood slowly, her breath steady, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. Fallon cleared his throat, the weight of the moment pressing against him. After reviewing the evidence, witness testimony, and procedural conduct, this court finds the defendant. A pause. The air seemed to hold its breath. Not guilty. The words detonated through the courtroom like an explosion. Gasps, cheers, disbelief. Miller's face drained of color, his fingers twitching at his sides. Elijah exhaled, his shoulders sagging in quiet relief. Maya didn't move at first, didn't breathe, didn't let herself feel it until she saw the way Fallon looked at her, not as a criminal, not as a case, but as a person. And then, finally, she allowed herself to smile. Maya stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight hitting her face like a slap, too bright, too sharp after weeks of cold, sterile rooms and artificial lighting. The cheers of protesters and supporters rang out, a wave of sound crashing against her ears, but she barely registered it. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted her name, microphones were thrust in her direction, demanding a statement, a reaction, something to feed the world's insatiable hunger for a story. But Maya wasn't a story. She was a girl who had just spent weeks fighting for the right to exist outside of a prison cell, and despite the judge's words, despite the victory she had just won, the world didn't feel any different. She wasn't naive enough to believe that one courtroom battle had changed anything. The system was still the system. And next time, it wouldn't be her. It would be someone else. Someone without the knowledge, without the fight, without the luck of having a grandfather who refused to let them sink. Elijah stood beside her, his presence grounding her as they pushed through the crowd. "Come on," he muttered, his grip on her shoulder firm but not forceful, guiding her through the chaos. A car door opened, and she slid inside without thinking, the door slamming shut behind her, muting the noise outside. She exhaled, her hands trembling in her lap, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Elijah settled in the driver's seat, silent for a moment, watching her in that way he always did, like he was waiting for her to figure something out on her own. Finally he spoke. "Now you know," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Now you know exactly what you're up against." Maya swallowed, her throat dry. "I knew before." Elijah shook his head. "No. You thought you knew. There's a difference." Across town, Judge Fallon sat in his dimly lit office, staring at the empty courtroom through the window. The echoes of the trial still lingered, the weight of his decision pressing heavier on him than he expected. He had spent years believing in the system, trusting its rules, enforcing its laws. But today, he had seen something else, something raw and undeniable, the way power was wielded not for justice, but for convenience. The way truth was only as strong as the person willing to fight for it. He had watched Maya Kingston dismantle a case built to destroy her, not because she had the resources, but because she had the knowledge. And knowledge, he realized, was more dangerous than any weapon. Maya sat in Elijah's living room, the legal books from the juvenile detention library still fresh in her mind, her fingers tracing invisible lines over the worn coffee table. She had spent weeks studying to save herself. But what about the ones who wouldn't know how? What about the kids who didn't have someone like Elijah telling them to stand tall, to keep fighting? She turned to him, her voice quieter than before, but certain. "I want to help people," she said. "I want to make sure no one else has to go through this alone." Elijah nodded once, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then you better start learning how to fight the right way." She already knew how to fight. She had been fighting her whole life. But now, she would do it with purpose. Not just for herself. Not just to survive. But to change something. To make sure the system that had tried to crush her would never do the same to someone else. Because this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning.